In early 1534, a ship returned to Manzanillo, its survivors related to Hernan Cortez, who had conquered the Aztec Empire 13 years earlier of an island they called Santa Cruz. They were led by their captain, Fortun Jimenez, who had been sent the year prior to help search for an expedition who was searching for the mythic Northwest Passage. Jimenez and others mutinied against the leaders of this search party and sailed northwest to this island. It is here where they found many black pearls in abundance, and also traded with the natives of the land for these pearls. Yet for some reason, there was a falling out with the Spanish and indigenous peoples, where the latter killed many, including Jimenez, and the few survivors returning back to their home port. Jimenez's expedition can be considered the first interaction of any Californian indigenous peoples with Europeans, and the nation they would come into contact with were the Pericues. The Pericues are a people that inhabited the southernmost part, the Cape of the Baja Peninsula. They are a very unique people, not only in the peninsula, but in all of the continent, due to being a language isolate and their physical appearance, described by researchers who had found Pericu skulls as hyperdolicocephalic. This has led to theories speculating an Austronesian origin to the Pericu people and their ancestors, probably a relic population unchanged from the peopling of the Americas. It is also important to mention the name Pericu is not what they named themselves, coming from the Spanish word for parakeet, due to missionaries comparing their speech to the bird. From what is known about them, there was no overarching name they ascribed to themselves, rather identifying with themselves according to their village. What are the origins of this nation? Archaeological research since the past century has discovered a similar tradition of burials south of 24 degrees latitude, the tip of the Baja Peninsula, that has become known as the Las Palmas Complex. Because the shape of the skulls found at Las Palmas sites, as well as the artifacts uncovered, are similar to the description of the Pericues and the items they used by historical accounts. The earliest radiocarbon dates of this tradition date back to between 1400 to 1100 BC, yet the height of this tradition occurred in the 1200s to 1700s AD. These burials are characterized as being found buried in caves in huge quantities, with individuals sometimes found buried back to back. It is believed they were deposited in sequence, or that they were placed in a single mortuary event. Archaeologists also divide the burials into primary and secondary categories. Primary burials were deposited after death, extended and articulated, usually wrapped in palm patates, while secondary burials show evidence of being exhumed, rearranged, and reburied. The way the bodies were buried also pointed to sub-traditions that appeared throughout the extent of the Las Palmas tradition. The oldest burials were extended, most of which were buried face up, and were most common from 400 to 800 AD. Flex burials, placed in the fetal position, began to be seen in 800 AD, and would continue into the contact era or 1700s. They also showed evidence of being tightly wrapped. According to Massey in the 60s, the burials consisted of, quote, depositing bound bundles of the defleshed bones of the dead, which had been painted with red ochre. These secondary burials were usually covered with deer skins or palm fronds, and accompanied by artifacts, unquote. The artifacts found in Las Palmas burials mentioned include round shaft wooden dart throwers, lark's head netting, Sum palm bark containers, and the notable hardwood tablas that were made by the peoples of the Baja California Peninsula. Another account by ornithologist Lyman Belding described the burial stating, quote, this skeleton was wrapped from the cloth made from the bark of the palm and bound with 3-ply cord, which had been plaited as sailors make senet, the material being fiber of the agave. The package, which was about 20 inches long, did not appear to have been disturbed since burial, although a femur and some small bones were missing, and nearly all of the bones had been unjointed. The bones of the hands were inside of the skull, which was full of small bones and sand, unquote. The remains of the Las Palmas peoples testified the hardy life they had to endure on the Cape of the Baja Peninsula, where from their teeth attest to diet sourced from the land and sea. Many of these remains also show evidence of trauma. One study found over 50% of male and 30% of female skulls showed evidence of cranial and or facial fractures. This may imply that violence was common among this group of peoples, and would coincide with the accounts that when the first Europeans arrived on the peninsula, there was a conflict between the Pericues and Guaycura, and pushing the former back more and more. Much of what we know of the historical Pericues comes from the accounts of Europeans who had landed on the southern cape of Baja California. They are described no different than what is known from the Las Palmas Complex. Hunter-gatherers, very tall and dark complexion, relying on the summer months to get their sustenance, which were dominated by slabs of meat cooked in hot coals and cactus. They would also forage for fruit, as well as fish and reed rafts. The habitation of the Pericues was either in caves or in huts made of stone and thatched roofs, where they would make beds out of leaves. Their clothing consists of skirts and girdles made from fiber and deer skins, and their hair would be decorated with beads and black pearls, which they also used for necklaces. The Pericu language was also unique, being a language isolate, once grouped in with the northern Guaycura, although this was proven wrong. Few words were recorded, most notable of which include place names and the names of supernatural spirits who were responsible for creating the world around them. Some of these include Niparaya, who was the lord who lived in the sky and created the earth, sea, and food. Anayikoyondi, the lady of the underworld. Guayaipe, the son of the previous two, who came down to earth and lived amongst man, sharing much knowledge with them. Tuparan, or Wak, he was Niparaya's enemy. Kukunumik, the creator of the moon. Puru Daubi, possibly Puru Taui, the creator of the stars. Lastly, the Pericues used longbows both for hunting and in battle, using yard-long arrows that were either tipped with flint or fire-hardened tips. It would be with these same weapons Jimenez and his men would be greeted by the Pericues. After this failed expedition, European contact with the Pericues was sporadic, and it was thanks to these brief occasions that are first-hand accounts of the Pericues, their appearance, and their lifestyle. Most notable is the 1709 account of Captain Woodes Rogers, an English privateer who made landfall for about a month in the Baja Peninsula, waiting for the Spanish Manila galleons to plunder. Thus, he lived amongst the Pericues and wrote about them. Some quotes include, "The language of the natives was as unpleasant to us as their aspect, for it was very harsh and broad, and they pronounced it so much in their throat as if their words had been ready to choke on them. We saw nothing like European furniture or utensils among them. Their huts were very low and made of branches of trees and reeds, but not sufficiently covered to keep out the rain. They had nothing like gardens or provisions around them. They subsisted chiefly on fish while we were here, which with the miserableness of their huts, that seemed only to be made for a time, made us conclude that they had no fixed habitation here, whatever they may have elsewhere, and that this late autumn, early winter, was their fishing season. We saw no nets or hooks, but wooden instruments with which they strike the fish, very dexterously, and dive to admiration. Some of our sailors told me that they saw one of them dive with his instrument, and while he was underwater, put up his striker with the fish on the point of it, which was taken off by another that watched him on a bark log. The reader may believe of this what he pleases, but I give it the more credit because I myself threw some rusty knives overboard on purpose to try those divers, who seldom missed catching a knife before it could sink 3 or 4 fathoms, which I took to be an extraordinary proof of their agility. Instead of bread, they used a little black seed which they grind by hand and eat by handfuls. Some of our men thicken their broth with it and say it tastes somewhat like coffee. They have some roots that eat like yams, a sort of seed that grows in pods and tastes like green peas, a berry that resembles those of ivy, and being dried at the fire eats like parched peas. They have another like a large currant with a white tartish pulp, a stone and a kernel. This sort of fruit they seem to value much. They also have fruit that grows on the prickle pear tree, tastes like gooseberries, and makes good sauce. They have many other trees and plants unknown to us." Unquote. Over 10 years later, in 1721, another English privateer, George Shelvocke, also came ashore after unsuccessfully trying to capture a Manila galleon. He wrote a more favorable account of the Pericues that he came into contact with, as opposed to that by his predecessor Rogers. "The men are tall, straight, and well made. Their limbs are large, their hair coarse and black, and barely reaches down to their shoulders. The women are of a much smaller size, their hair is much longer than the men, and with it some of their faces are almost covered. Some of both sexes have good countenances, but we thought them to be of a much darker complexion than any of the Indians we has seen in the coasts of these seas, these being of a dark copper color. They seem to lead a careless life, and to have everything in common among them, and can be supposed to search for nothing but the bare necessities of life, vice, meat, and drink, which frees them from the anxieties which disturb the thoughts of nations more civilized and more refined. Their contentment made them honest, for they never offered to pilfer or steal any of our tools and other utensils, although they might have been of great service to them. In a word, they seemed to pass their lives according to the notions we have of purest simplicity of the earliest ages of the world, before discord and contention were heard of among men, which must be owing to the great distance of their situation, and their being so much out of the reach of those who might have taught them other things." Unquote. Although the first mission in Pericu territory was established in 1697, the Jesuits began to establish missions in the area from the 1720s onwards, maybe as a reaction to the English using the area to stage attacks on ships as previously mentioned. At the time, it was estimated the Pericu nation only numbered 5,000. Disease would afflict much of their population. not aided by the atrocities committed at the hands of the Spaniards, as well as not being allowed to practice their beliefs. The Guamas, the Pericu shamans, insisted that the people take up arms against the Spaniards. This would culminate in 1734 when in Santiago, Father Lorenzo Carranzo, worried about the rumors of an upcoming indigenous revolt, he sent his only 2 soldiers to send messages for reinforcements to an already under-garrisoned peninsula, with only 1, at most 3 soldiers, or even none, guarding the settlements and missions of the Cape. While they were gone, the Pericues captured the priest and dragged him out by his feet, pleading with them, although it was useless. Accounts vary that he was filled with arrows and then clubbed to death, or just the latter. This was the beginning of the Pericu revolt. Missionaries began to be evacuated after this event to the friendlier Cochimi lands, or told to go to Loreto and fortify the settlement, with letters sent to the Viceroy of New Spain in Mexico City, Antonio de Viceron y Eguillarreta. At the time, however, the government and Jesuits were hostile towards one another, so the Viceroy was reluctant to spare any soldiers to aid the missionaries. One horseman named Don Francisco Cortés y Monroy came with 50 native Yaqui allies as reinforcements, where he joined up with 20 Spanish soldiers and another 100 native allies. They scoured the locations that had been burned and destroyed, identifying the remains they found. It would not be until months later they would skirmish with the Pericu rebels. Meanwhile, a Manila galleon making its way down the coast went into port in modern-day San Jose del Cabo, as it was there the previous year that Father Temeral had allowed them to make landfall and gave them provisions. Unbeknownst to the crew of the galleon, Father Temeral had been killed shortly after Father Carranzo. A small boat made its way to land and was met with a volley of Pericu arrows, killing 5 Spaniards. The ship made its way a little further down the coast and made landfall again. Here they were met by a native named Geronimo, who said Father Temeral was sick at the moment, but he would come meet the Spaniards the following day. The captain began to suspect something was going on, and thus it came as no surprise when they were greeted in the morning by 600 Pericu warriors. A battle ensued with minimal casualties on both sides, and Geronimo and 4 other natives were put in chains. By this point, this rebellion had reached the ears of the Spanish court and how it was disrupting trade in the Pacific. An infuriated Felipe V wrote a letter to Viceron, telling him to cut the act and aid the Jesuits in any way possible. With these orders, the Viceroy sent a hard-headed commander, Huidiburo, to assist the Jesuits. When he arrived, however, he did not listen to any advice the missionaries gave him to subdue the Pericu rebels. Thus, it eventually took Huidiburo 2 more years to finally put down the revolt in 1738. By this time, the Pericu population had been destroyed, and those that remained were carried off by disease. By the 1750s, the Pericu ceased to exist as a people, lost to history. These peoples are a testament to how long the indigenous peoples of the Baja California Peninsula have lived there, with speculations that they were a relic population of Paleo Natives that had remained virtually unchanged and had adapted to the rough desert environment of the region, as well as fighting for their land and survival for thousands of years.